Hello, everyone. We're just getting set up. Welcome, though, to this webinar. We'll probably start in a minute or so. So I can see the participant list is flying up. Again, we'll wait for a little longer and then we'll kick off the webinar. Okay, so one more minute, I think. Still getting lots of people registering. So if I can just ask you to bear with us while people join. We're clocking close to 200 people. So just a question someone asked in the chat, will the chat be enabled? Actually, the chat won't be enabled for participants. However, there will be a Q&A. So please use that function throughout the webinar. Okay, I think we're going to kick off. We're 2 minutes past the hour. Firstly, a very warm welcome from WWF and BCG. My name is Mark Griffiths, and I lead climate business at WWF. And today we're fortunate enough to hear from a number of authors and contributors in the development of this document called A Blueprint for Corporate Action on Climate and Nature. And in terms of the flow of today, if you can go to the next slide, I'd like to introduce you to our speakers. And the flow and the agenda for today will be as follows. So initially, we'll hear from Vanessa Pires Sirera, who is the Deputy Practice Leader for Climate and Energy at WWF. We will then hear from Martha Stevenson, who leads our forest work, also from WWF. She'll tell us more about why we're doing this work and the relation to climate and nature. And thereafter, we'll hear from Brad Shallett, who's the Director of Carbon Markets, Governance and Aviation, also from WWF, who will drop down into some of the detail behind this blueprint. And again, today's session is all about understanding why we've done this work and how we expect it to be implemented. After that, we have Paulina Ponsa de Leon Barrida, who's going to ask Fran Price, who's our practice leader of forest and at WWF, as well as Michel Fredeur, the global leader of climate and environment, and is also the managing director and senior partner at BCG. Paulina is going to ask for reflections from those people. And then the idea is towards the second part of this hour-long webinar, we plan to have an interactive piece where participants can ask questions in the Q&A box. So please keep those questions coming. We'll try and answer them in real time and get back to those who we can't answer today. Just a final point is, please note that this session will be recorded. And also, I'd like to note that this has been a real labor of love because it's taken a long time for us to put this together, but it's gone through lots of iterations, lots of blood, sweat, and tears, and there's been lots of contributors. So thank you to all those contributors inside WWF as well as within BCG. So on that, I'd like to hand over to Vanessa to give some opening remarks. Thanks, Vanessa.
Thank you, Mark, and welcome everyone. In my view, three important developments have marked 2020 in what bring us together today. First, with more than 1,000 companies subscribing, science-based targets is starting to become the mainstream benchmark for credible and comparable Paris-aligned corporate commitments. Second, nature-based solutions which use ecosystems to tackle the most relevant societal challenge, in this case, climate change, started to paint strongly on the global political agenda, paired with IUCN launch of the Nature-Based Solutions Global Standard, which not only calls for these interventions to ensure net social and biodiversity benefits, but for these benefits to be measurable and sustained in time. Third, despite the COVID crisis, 2020 saw the highest number of corporate climate commitments thus far, with companies wanting to go farther, willing to do their fair share to offset their entire impacts, and making a tangible contribution towards sorting both the nature loss and global warming crisis. These three developments must not be underestimated. However, on the one hand side, there is still yet little guidance out there connecting these three key developments, and on the other hand, little clarity from the general public to be able to rate whether companies are actually doing this, whether their climate claims are credible, and then take subsequent informed consumption decisions. What we will present today, in partnership with the Boston Consulting Group, attempts at doing exactly this. From a climate perspective, this work is particularly relevant for a variety of reasons. First, the relentless rise in global temperature, with 2020 on track to be one of the 3 warmest years on record. Second, the political momentum being raised by both COP26 UK presidency, as well as the non-state actors champions through the race to zero. And third, the Paris Agreement entering into force at the beginning of 2021, with governments and consumers raising their expectations and requirements from the corporate sector. I really, truly hope that you enjoy this webinar. Let me hand over to Martha to take us more deeply into the motivation of the blueprint, and again, reiterate my thanks to all the WWF and BCG staff behind this. Also, all of the business partners which have accompanied us through this thinking path throughout the years, and those who have committed to a science-based targets, and of course, others who are already going beyond in a variety of ways. Martha, over to you.
Great. Thank you, Vanessa, and thanks so much to everyone for joining us today for the launch of the Corporate Climate Mitigation Blueprint. I must say it's been really wonderful to work across our climate, forest, and science teams at WWF and in partnership with BCG to develop this thinking. I will first take you through the context for the document and unpack our core rationale for why we did this work, and then hand it over to Brad on our climate team to walk you through the blueprint specifically. First, we're thrilled with the commitments that companies have been making to support climate action and fill leadership gaps. But we are all experiencing inconsistency in claims with varying levels of ambition. Climate neutral, net zero, climate positive. These are just a few of the claims that we've recently seen in the headlines, and their ambitions are all slightly different, covering different greenhouse gases, different abatement strategies, different portions of the supply chain, and different timelines. To put a fine point on it with an example, companies who do no reductions and simply purchase offsets, and companies that's reflected on the left, and companies who are doing the hard work of reductions in line with a 1.5 degree future and compensating for remaining emissions are both using the term carbon neutrality in the marketplace, when this obviously represents very different levels of effort. Any robust climate strategy should align with the mitigation hierarchy. Avoid, reduce, restore and then and only then compensate. Skipping over avoid and reduce directly to compensate has high risk of not delivering a viable climate future for nature and people, as reflected in the special report on 1.5. Clear guidance on an ambitious climate pathway and how to differentiate a company in the marketplace was a main driver for this blueprint. Also, as Vanessa mentioned, in recent years, there has been growing interest in the climate mitigation potential of nature-based solutions, given the many, many co-benefits that they produce for nature and people. And when nature-based solutions are done well, they can build resilience into ecosystems and communities to lessen the impacts of climate change. Many countries have included actions on nature-based solutions in their nationally determined contributions, signifying the political will there is to foster strong public-private partnerships. And at least 6 countries are on the cusp of issuing high-quality, ambitious jurisdictional red credits in the next 2 years, provided they receive that market signal. Several organizations and coalitions are channeling corporate interest toward nature-based solutions, some broad, some focused on a specific intervention. But the success of these investments to deliver climate outcomes critically depends on the quality of their implementation. These efforts must meet the challenges of additionality, leakage, and permanence, as well as the essential need to be locally owned and build good governance and benefit sharing into the model. Ensuring nature-based solutions are designed and implemented properly was another reason for our development of this blueprint. One of the disruptions of this work is really moving away from the CO2 metric. The CO2 metric can lead to reductionist thinking focused on an individual footprint and backward-looking approaches. This is great for the avoid and reduce parts of the mitigation hierarchy, but the goalposts have changed, and companies are now looking forward to their transition to a net zero company as part of a net zero economy, and need to move beyond into system transitions thinking. The CO2 metric can focus on quantity over quality and lead to the pursuit of low-cost carbon credits, where high-quality carbon credits that deliver co-benefits for nature and people are more desirable. Also, the CO2 metric incentivizes investments in actions that deliver immediate, verifiable CO2 reductions, and this will lock us into the current solution set, which we all know is not sufficient. Over the next 5 to 10 years, we will need space for innovation in nature-based solutions, in technology solutions, in science and research, and new business models that lead us to a low-carbon future. Having flexibility in a system is required to develop and expand the next generation of climate mitigation solutions. So we've written this blueprint to connect 3 elements of climate strategy. First, reinforce the importance of starting with science-based targets and following the mitigation hierarchy. Second, provide guidance and the space to include nature-based solutions and innovation appropriately within the corporate climate strategy. And third, connect all of this with guidance on high integrity carbon credits and projects. And with that context, I will now turn it over to Brad to walk you through the blueprint.
All right, thank you, Martha. Martha just explained the background for why we wanted to create this. And so now I'm going to introduce you to the corporate climate mitigation blueprint at a high level. I'll go into detail on one of the steps after I give you the overview here. And then we're actually going to walk through a hypothetical situation as if we were a company using the blueprint. So, but first, let me get into the steps of the blueprint. Step 1 is to account and disclose your emissions. It also means disclosing climate-related risks and opportunities and strategies that are in line with the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures. Step 2 is to reduce your own value chain emissions in line with a science-based pathway. So companies can do this through the Science-Based Targets Initiative. This helps start to ensure that a concept called the mitigation hierarchy, which Martha just referenced, is reflected. And so that's avoid emissions first, then reduce emissions, restore land to benefit nature and climate, and only then compensate for those remaining emissions. Now, step 3 is that once a company has set its science-based trajectory for its own value chain emissions and delivering on them, it should look at the remaining emissions that is not reduced to zero and quantify what the financial commitment is to address those emissions for further positive impact. So we'll talk more about step 3 a bit more in just a second, but let me get through the full set of steps here before I do that. Step 4 is when you actually do the investment. And there are a variety of ways that companies can invest and can do so in combination here. So first is that a company can cut emissions more than its science-based pathway requires. Second, it could invest in unlocking climate solutions. So what we mean by that, it really encompasses a large variety of interventions. And these interventions might not actually result immediately in a ton of carbon reduced or removed for some time. So examples include R&D into new clean technology. It includes on the land side, on the landscape scale side, investing intelligently to tackle the drivers of deforestation, perhaps by helping to support land tenure for indigenous people and local communities. And then the third option, I think most people are more familiar with, and that's investing in near-term climate mitigation outcomes. And what I effectively mean there are carbon credits. So carbon credits occur, or offsets occur when a project developer demonstrates that it reduces emissions or removes them from the atmosphere. Then a third party verifies whether it actually happened. Then the project developer issues carbon credits, which can be purchased by companies. So these are the different options for how to invest once you've quantified this financial commitment to your remaining emissions. It's important to note, though, that alongside and throughout, companies should be considering how they influence climate policy for the better, because the systemic changes that we need to reach a low carbon future and transform the global economy will require policy. Companies should also be looking for how they're going to collaborate with peers and other stakeholders to deliver the greatest amount of impact. And then finally, the companies should consider how they are building resilience for themselves as a company, but also to think about the investments they're making in step 4 and throughout their climate strategy, and think about how they're going to be durable given our changing climate before they make those investments. So next slide, please. I mentioned earlier I was going to dive deep into one of the steps, and this is the quantify the financial commitment step. So Martha talked about some of the main reasons, the main drivers for why we did this. And step 3 really is the crux of that. So as a reminder, the blueprint recommends that you quantify your financial commitment using a given carbon price and then multiply that with the company's remaining emissions. So for example, company X commits to price CO2 equivalent they emit at $20 a ton today, and then escalate that to $100 a ton by 2030. So this is just an example here. We don't provide a specific recommendation for what the price should be for a company. But in general, I think we would say that it would be great if companies go as high as they can. The classical approach to address remaining emissions is to buy carbon credits in an amount that's equal to the company's remaining emissions and then claim carbon neutrality. But step 3 is a little bit of a different approach. And the benefits of doing this, calculating the financial commitment in this way are several. First is that it encourages companies to look broader than the current set of solutions that are in the voluntary carbon market. So again, investing in things like support for land tenure for indigenous peoples, those don't really count to carbon neutrality goals, but they're really critical for the systemic change that we need to see. This new approach is inclusive of those types of investments. This approach also, we think, can stimulate a race to the top. So companies can say, you know, my carbon price that I'm using is higher than yours. So that's a positive benefit of this, we think. And we think it also will increase the incentives for companies to reduce their own value chain emissions reductions, because what's effectively happening is the delivery of an internal carbon price that's felt throughout the company. I'd also note that this approach does support companies that still want to use carbon credits, but what it allows is for a company to amass a more sizable budget to spend on carbon credits, so it doesn't feel like it has to buy the cheapest ones on the market. So next slide, please. I'm going to take you through an example of, and pretend that we're a company. So starting in step 1, we account and disclose emissions. Step 2, we set a science-based target. And you can see how when we set a science-based target, our company will reduce all the emissions in the green. Next slide. So now's the time that we quantify our financial commitments. So we look out over, let's say, 5 years. And the company has 5 million remaining emissions over those years. We might actually be doing this on an annual basis. But let's apply a $20 a ton carbon price. What does that give us? Well, that allows us to set aside $100 million. Now, the next step is how we spend that. Next slide. Yep. And the way that this company has decided to invest is to do a portfolio approach. So it allocates $25 million for further emissions reductions that go beyond its science-based target. It spends the bulk of this money on unlocking climate solutions, and then the remainder on high-quality carbon credits. So that's just one example of how a company could deploy this framework, but not the only. And next slide, please. I think some stakeholders on this call might be aware of the large amount of net zero commitments that are coming up, and also the Science-Based Target Initiative's upcoming standard for net zero targets. So we developed this blueprint to actually nest and connect to this Science-Based Targets Initiative process. And you can see how the blueprint is applied over time against a net zero trajectory here. I think the two other things that I point out about this graphic is that the concept of residual emissions and neutralization actions. So remember, we were just looking a moment ago at 5 years, but this goes over a longer time span. And as decarbonization occurs, for many companies, there might be residual emissions that are just way too hard to abate after significant effort. And so these need to be neutralized by removing them by removing other emissions from the atmosphere. So that's what's being shown at the far end of this graphic out towards 2050. So I'll conclude here with explaining a little bit of the next steps as we're thinking forward with the blueprint. Of course, especially companies, please reach out to us if you're interested in using the blueprint or have questions about it. I think we're also planning to do a little bit more work on certain aspects of the blueprint. For example, mapping how corporate climate claims map to the corporate climate mitigation blueprint, providing additional specific guidance on how to quantify a financial commitment relative to a company's impact and financial means. We're looking at how to provide additional guidance for the selection and procurement of nature-based solutions. And then finally, we might be looking at how to prioritize investments across specific sectors. So with that, I'll turn it over to Paulina from BCG to facilitate our Q&A here. Thanks.
Great, thank you, Brad, and thank you, Martha. Thank you, everyone, for presenting, for joining us, and also I want to thank WWF for the collaboration on this. So we'll start with a couple of reflections from Fran and Michelle, and then we will open this up for questions. So Fran, you are the WWF's global lead for the forest practice. From your perspective, why is this a valuable approach that companies should be taking? And yeah, I'll stop there. So what do you see in these that companies should be listening to?
Thank you, Paulina, and great to be here with everyone today. So I'm really excited about the blueprint. As Martha mentioned, we've seen surging interest over the last few years in the role that forests can play in climate mitigation. We're seeing that both in the policy realm and in the corporate realm. The blueprint really solves some of our challenges across our climate and forest agendas. It ensures that the integrity is maintained in achieving both our climate goals and our forest goals, and it limits the negative trade-offs there. So it provides a way that our forest and climate agendas can move towards being mutually reinforcing, and that's exactly where they need to be. The blueprint also provides a pathway for positive forest actions on the part of companies, whether it be stopping deforestation or improve forest management or putting nature on a path towards restoration by 2050, either within supply chains or value chains or contributing to global efforts. So that's incredibly exciting. In my mind, this is a big step forward in the tools that we have to solve some of our most pressing global challenges, one being nature loss and particularly forest loss, and the other being the climate crisis. So thank you.
Thanks, Fran. Michelle, let's hear the business perspective. So environment work. What's the value for these from a business perspective?
So thank you, Paulina. Look, I think we need a framework that is as holistic as possible and covers all the levers, because we all know that given the problem we need to solve in front of you, all levers will need to be pushed as far as they can. So the value of the framework really is to try to lay out the different options. So that's one, in a holistic way. But the most important, it does order and prioritize the levers. Because as we all know, it starts with mitigation. And why does it start with mitigation? It starts with mitigation because for all corporations, being compatible in terms of operations, product and services with a 1.5 degrees world, it will require to decarbonize the value chain completely, and therefore to transform. It's a complete transformation that companies need to have. So starting with the mitigation aspect, I think is the right way to go to really push the needle as much as possible. The second innovation that I see in this framework is to quantify. Because corporations, in corporations, you do trade-offs between different investments. So quantifying the remaining and what needs to be done allows to put an amount of money, and I agree with Brad, hopefully the bigger possible, to start thinking about how I'm going to allocate between the different levers that a given company has. And here, I think that further mitigation, I think, should be the number one. I remind that the analysis shows that with the current technologies, the one that exists, you can reduce by 80% the emissions. I'm not saying that all these levers are completely economical, 100% depending on the industry, the sector, but they exist. And therefore, putting a number might, enable to think twice about triggering further emissions, even with levers that might cost a little bit more. So that's one. And then, incentivizing companies to start thinking about innovation is a critical element. It's critical because climate needs it, so we need innovation, but also it's important because for companies themselves, it's the opportunity to create an advantage. Because once you're in front of the situation, I think it's the role of corporation to make sure that they are sustainable in the responsible way, but sustainable also in front of their investors. And therefore, investing in innovation and starting to think about, what new business models, what new technologies they can develop, I think is a very important framework. And the last one, which is not the least one, as you just said, nature is a fundamental element, and exactly giving a framework on where to invest to get quality type of offsets and investments in the nature, I think is important. Again, by prioritizing, avoid, reduce, restore, and compensate. So I think the holistic aspect and the prioritization, I think, gives a very good framework. The other thing that I wanted to do is also identify, the fact that there's an important word on the collaboration, because the new source of competitive advantage, I think, for corporations, once, in the way they're going to decarbonize and reinvent their new business model, is new ways of collaboration, because there's so much you can do at the frontier of your own company. And here, in this challenge, companies will need not only to cooperate with other companies in the sectors, but will need to cooperate throughout the whole value chain. And those companies who will be more at ease and more performant in a leading ecosystem to drive the change will be the winners of tomorrow.
Thank you, Michel. We're going to open it up for questions, and there's one of the first questions that came up is around the use of avoidance carbon credits and whether those should be counted as real reduction carbon credits. Brad, we've been talking about credible strategies, and maybe you can give us your perspective on how companies can credibly be using these different tools.
Yeah, thanks, Pauline. Yeah, I think there's sort of a outstanding question on what avoidance carbon credits and real reduction carbon credits are. I think sometimes folks will explain them as the same thing. And the reason is that when you have a carbon credit, you're basically trying to, with credits where you're trying to reduce emissions, you're avoiding what would have happened otherwise, right? So I have seen some work that kind of tries to define a clearer separation between what's an avoidance credit and what's a maybe real reduction credit. And that some have indicated that an avoidance credit is where you have an increasing baseline. So let's say deforestation is expected to increase over time and you're avoiding that. And that a real reduction credit might be something where you have a stable or neutral baseline and then you're reducing from that, or even decreasing baseline and then reducing from that. So I think in some ways it's not entirely clear, the taxonomy out there in the carbon market world on what the difference is, or if there is a difference. But I think that, as we're looking at the different credits out on the market, I don't think we got to this in the presentation in a good amount of detail, but if we're thinking about the mitigation hierarchy, we should really first be looking at how to avoid emissions first. And so at least in the near term, we should be looking at the credits that are avoiding emissions or reducing emissions before we jump to removals, removing carbon from the atmosphere. So reforestation is one example of that. It doesn't mean that we don't need to remove carbon from the atmosphere. It doesn't mean that those aren't necessarily things that we need, but we need to make sure that we're not having a sort of negative effect on the market. And with the focus, the major focus on tree planting recently from the corporate community, what it's done to carbon credits in the market is increase the price of removals credits sort of artificially, right? So I think that we need to recognize that that there are good credits out there that are avoiding or reducing emissions, and we shouldn't be just jumping to removals credits immediately.
Okay. Martha, maybe if I can ask you to follow up on that and build on that answer. There's another question from Christoph about remaining versus residual emissions. Can you tackle that one, please?
Sure. I mean, this is one of those key areas that we will follow up with more guidance because it's really going to be sector and business specific. I think right now we're really saying to distinguish between remaining and residual is that residual, you have to give a really good effort at reducing. So let's just make sure that we are trying to decarbonize, that we're trying to address those emissions within our supply chain in line with science. And the residuals discussion is something we should be having in 10 or more years. And so I really think the timeline that we're introducing with this of focusing on reductions for the next 10 years and setting up the innovation framework for after 2030 is really important here. And then we can start drawing some of these hard lines between remaining and residual, but let's really focus this next 10 years on action on reductions. And that to me is sort of the spirit of what we're saying here.
Thank you. I'm going to go to Sarah's question. So she asked that, I'll read her question, and Chris, maybe if you can tackle this one. The task force to scale the voluntary carbon market seems to seek to scale business as usual carbon offsetting with little attention to incentivizing or scaling high impact carbon credits. Do you see a risk, Chris, from WWF's perspective here, especially as the financial sector and heavy emitters are getting involved in this space?
Well, I can try, but I will also punt the answer to Brad, our real carbon markets expert, who's been very involved in following the task force. I mean, it's a great question, Sarah, and I think that the key distinction between quantity and quality is what we just have to keep pushing on. The whole idea of the task force, at least the stated goal, is to scale the voluntary carbon market, which sort of accepts that the status quo of the voluntary carbon market is something that we want to see scaled by an order of magnitude. And I think there are some really important questions about whether that's true based on the existing state of the market in terms of price and quality. And my colleague Brad is leading WWF's work on kind of how we assess quality within carbon credits, and how we kind of how we can start to scale quality carbon credits rather than just scaling the market as a whole. So I don't know if you want to add anything there, Brad.
Not much. I mean, I think as part of that task force, Sarah, there is a focus on quality. It's part of that framework, but I think it's worrying a lot of stakeholders still that that quality might be compromised, and it's unclear how the sort of quality recommendations are going to be implemented. So that's one thing that we'll be looking at. And we like Chris mentioned, there's a project we have with Environmental Defense Fund and OCO Institute called the Carbon Credit Guidance for Buyers, which is doing a really detailed look at quality in the market. Hasn't been done for quite a while. And you really do need to take a detailed look at the market and not just have principles that you try to apply. You really do need some deep assessment to ensure that quality is ensured throughout the market.
Thanks, Brad. Thanks, Chris. Fran, there's a question from David about how the issue of climate change mitigations can be connected with the social, economic, and political system in poor countries. Can you please address that?
Yeah, this is a great question and a huge challenge, and it's something that we collectively need to figure out together, and with communities in places. In forested countries and jurisdictions. I think we really need to look at community-driven approaches that meet the guidelines that we're putting in place of credible forest carbon work along the lines of the guidelines that Brad mentioned. And we also need to build capacity within local communities around getting to those sorts of efforts that actually provide mitigation opportunities, but are locally driven. And we need to look more at equitable benefit sharing. I don't think that we as a community really understand the state of play there. And so that's an area that we're going to be looking into much more deeply in the near future. But those are some of the issues that we need to explore to get to the answers to that very good question. But we're on a pathway to do that. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Fran. There's a question about how should we be thinking about implementing the blueprint in countries where there's no regulated carbon market, and maybe we can talk about how this is really about voluntary actions. And Brad, how do you see this fitting into the broader regulated space?
Yeah, I think this is voluntary action, and so I think in some ways this is sort of sending a signal to regulators in a way that companies are ready for ambitious action. But this is also why we've included policy as part of the framework itself, as part of the blueprint, and something that you do throughout, right? Because it's not just about the individual company. It's not just about your company. It's about your peers. It's about the broader economy. And so for that systemic change to happen, there needs to be policy engagement, and for companies to raise their voice and to align their own actions within their company with how their associations may do advocacy for government policy too. So yeah, so there's definitely a connection there.
Can I jump in on that just from the land sector side?
Please.
I mean, I think a lot of what Fran was talking about of these, jurisdictional or landscape scale initiatives, and really making sure that those initiatives are aligned with country submitted baselines to the UNFCCC. That's what we need to make sure is matched up. That's really independent of whether or not we have a regulated market or not. And that will kind of allow us not to be constrained by those conditions, but still advance really good work. But again, make sure you're aligning with country NDCs and with the baseline. And then that will ensure that your work can be credible moving forward.
Okay. Michelle, from the business perspective, is there anything that you'd like to add on the policy side? What do you think companies need from government, or how should they be engaging in policy as well?
Well, it's sure that the policy gives a framework in which gives more certainty to companies to make investments. So that's for sure. And we see that in Europe, probably the model is a little bit more advanced right now than the rest of the world in terms of policies. So that's one. Now, I was going to say, at the end of the day, again, it's preparing your company for the future. And you can observe that you've got a lot of companies that have made move without the policy. If you look at Dalmia Cement, high-emitting sector in India, they've made significant moves without the policy element, just because they want to create a decarbonized offer to their customers. I think, yes, policy is important, but in our experience, the main driver that makes company move is demand, to be frank, because that's what companies do. They respond to their customers. So I think what is lacking today, unfortunately, is that in our system, I think the governments are starting to move, at least in Europe, but you see China, you see the others. The investors are starting to get it. Companies are more and more getting into the SBTi and the disclosure movement. I think what is lacking really is the demand. So it's us as consumers, and by the way, also public procurement, because with all these stimuli that we're going to put on the market, just to make sure that governments, through the investments they're going to do in the relaunching of the economies, make sure that they buy green products, would be a major difference. So for me, policy, of course, is important, but the real factor that will drive and accelerate change from the corporation standpoint is the demand.
Okay, thank you. Martha, I'm going to come back to you with a question from Santiago about whether there's a position on how companies should be disclosing their contributions to greenhouse gas removals beyond the reduction targets.
Yeah, I mean, the WRI greenhouse gas protocol currently right now, you can report your removals, but just outside of the scopes. And there's a process underway to develop guidance on removals and carbon sequestration that will provide additional guidance on what elements of removals can be brought inside the scope. So right now, absolutely, you can disclose that information. CDP has space for it. The GHG reporting protocol has space for it. But how that happens could change here in the near future. And so I would say just watch this space.
Great, thank you. There's another question from Andrew McMillan. So he's asking, if a company invests in initiatives that cannot be counted using carbon, we will need WWF or a similar organization to validate those investments to make sure that companies are actually having the impact that they want to have. What's your perspective on how we should be evaluating these investments if we're not sticking to the carbon metric? Maybe Martha, you can start us off with that.
Sure, I think Vanessa at the beginning referenced the IUCN standard on nature-based solutions, and I think that's a really good place to start. And WWF will be building out, we have some projects and we'll be building out more projects that adhere to these standards. In Appendix 2 of the blueprint, we highlight some of those key criteria that you need to look for in nature-based solution investments. And then it's part of the work kind of outside of nature-based solutions. This is an area where we need more guidance when we start looking at some of the R&D investments in that tech innovation space. What does it look like to start disclosing those investments and being clear about how you're trying to transition to a low carbon economy? And I would say transparency will lead the way, and we'll figure out guidance as we go. But we know we need this innovation in this space. Otherwise, we're kind of locked into the current solution set. So this is an area for further work with some pieces in place, but we know that there's more to come.
Thanks, Martha. There's also a question from Christina, and I'm going to read it out loud. How do you recommend to reduce your emissions in the value chain when, as a company, you've already made this shift and sell only plant-based food? What else could you be doing from that perspective beyond electric delivery and better packaging? I think in some ways this is a question about if you've made your whole business around delivering a solution, what else should we be doing? Who'd like to take that question?
Well, maybe I can jump in. I think I think the answer that was already listed in the question would be a good place to start. There's even the greenest of companies that are selling the greenest of products still have emissions to reduce through their value chains, logistics, company operations, etc. And after everything that's feasible to be reduced can be reduced, that's when you would move on to step 3 and step 4 of the blueprint. So absolutely, delivery, packaging, like all sorts of things would be useful. The production, I'm not aware of any type of plant-based food that can be produced without GHG emissions quite yet. So I'm sure there's still some production-related emissions opportunities as well. But absolutely, that there's always opportunities to do more of steps 1 and 2. But there's also a reason that we have steps 3 and 4.
Maybe I'll just
go ahead, Martha.
build on it. The land sector is one of those interesting sectors where you have both opportunities for reductions and removals. And thinking about those removals, I saw a few comments about regenerative ag. This is the space that lives, right? In that step 2, when we're really looking at how do we produce these renewable products and make sure that we're renewing the soil as we go, that we have strong forest management, pasture management, and ag management practices in place that are truly making these renewable products. And so that's where I would also focus, is in that production space, and not thinking about only reductions, but also how do we increase sequestration through these processes as well.
Great, thank you. So we've been getting a set of questions that are about how companies can get involved, and also what are some other efforts that are underway. I'll highlight James's question. about who in the community is working on frameworks to address abatement and reduction of Scope 3 emissions in complicated supply chains. And so maybe Brad, like, what would you recommend companies look at in terms of some of the players in the ecosystem and resources that can be available for companies here?
Wow, yeah, there are a lot of different organizations working on supply chain reductions. I mean, there are folks across WWF doing this in different goal teams. I think one thing I'll point out is something called the Value Change Initiative. That's run by Gold Standard. That's looking at how you actually get supply chain reductions and get credit for them, right? So that's just those are just a few examples, but there are a lot of organizations out there that are looking at how to address supply chain emissions. So wouldn't be able to comprehensively name all of them here. Other colleagues might want to throw out other initiatives, though.
Yeah, I mean, it depends on the type of emission you're talking about. Certainly the CDP supply chain program, is a well-established and influential one surrounding kind of gathering more primary data from suppliers. One of WWF's key partners, Walmart, and their Project Gigaton has done, very scaled work in this as well. In terms of the land sector and particularly deforestation, there's a whole other set of initiatives around that my forest colleagues could mention more.
Brad, there's a question about claims that I'm going to send your way, if that's okay. So this is Luca's question. He's saying, based on the blueprint, if a company contributes financially to address the remaining carbon emissions, what would be the claim? Like, what do you achieve? What's the claim? Do they become carbon neutral? What's the incentive for companies to do this?
Yeah. Great question. Yeah, and like I mentioned earlier, we haven't actually taken the full step of mapping different claims onto the blueprint, but we can explore a little bit right here. So it doesn't necessarily preclude a company from claiming carbon neutrality if the company is buying, emissions reductions or removals to cover its remaining emissions. And if $100 million gets you that, then you can technically claim carbon neutrality. I think that however, this framework does allow sort of for other types of claims. One is called climate positive, which WWF has been working on with IKEA, H&M, and others out in the world. And climate positive, the concept of that is going beyond just addressing those remaining emissions and netting them out. It's about bigger investments. It's about unlocking climate solutions. It's about even more carbon credits than what than just breaking even, right, with and netting them out. So so there's a lot of other claims that we haven't done a full mapping to those, but that's hopefully something we'll be doing as one of our next steps.
Yeah, I think the other thing that we're seeing from companies is that by implementing a lot of these things, sometimes you get savings, right? So a lot of these can be cost efficient. You can also be gaining competitive advantage, building growth, and as Michelle was saying, just setting yourself up for the future. So there's really much more value that a company can extract than just the claim and the newspaper headline. Go ahead, Martha.
I also say, on the land sector side, I mean, there's really great storytelling here. And that's why we've seen a lot of companies invest in specific projects, because they really are producing these nature and people co-benefits. And there are great stories to be had there. And so I think, again, just getting away from some of the math, looking at business value and where there are other stories to be told can really enhance the overall outcome of the investment.
Vanessa, we have 5 minutes left. Are there any last reflections that you'd like to share with the group?
Thank you, Paulina, and thank you all for the great webinar. I think you just raised the very important questions around. So I'd like to finish with a couple of reflections. The first one is really, I mean, I didn't think that the year would end with such a positive note of what we saw on Saturday on the Global Climate Ambition Summit. I mean, despite COVID, some important countries are, stepping up in their ambition, their climate commitments, and that will have an impact both in terms of regulation and delivery, right? And so that's critically important. The second is, I think that the youth movement and the consumers are also waking up and really trying to be more informed on what happens next. And as we enter 2021, which will be a key year for delivery, both on climate because of landmark COP26 and the start of the kickoff of the Paris Agreement, as well as the post-2020 biodiversity framework, that's kind of what the world is expecting from civil society, consumers, and companies. And so 3 things that I kind of take away from this webinar, of course, in addition to what the content, the core content of the blueprint are the first one is innovation. There's still a lot of place to innovate within the framework and just in general. So companies can be not only responsible, but leading actors in the planetary change. The second one is getting ahead of the game, getting ahead of the curve. So more stringent and impactful regulations will come for sure. And I think companies, if companies abide to this framework and this blueprint, they'll be doing a lot in getting kind of ahead of the curve and the game. And the third one is a general call to all consumers and citizens to really drive demand, and that will push companies towards what we want to see. And what we want to see is every one of us being those responsible and leading actors in these very, very needed planetary change. So thank you so much, Paulina and everyone, and over to you or to Fran directly.
Okay, thank you, Vanessa. Thank you, Paulina. Thank you, everyone, for participating in the great questions that we had today. I just want to say something about the urgency of the moment and the fact that we are really on the verge of looking at a future that does not look so bright if we don't come together and pivot and do more than we expect of ourselves. We just need to step up, and companies have such an important role to play in that stepping up. They're such an important piece of this puzzle. And I think the blueprint really does provide a credible, rigorous pathway forward that we can align our climate and forest agendas and really move actions forward on the ground and get resources to local communities and people that need it to be able to implement good practices and the stewardship that they've done for eons. So I think this is just a really important moment, and I just want to thank the team that's put this all in place. Thank you.
Okay, we're drawing to a close. I'd just like to echo Fran's point about the urgency. So we know that in 2020, we will reduce our emissions globally between 4.5% and 7%. And what we need to do for the next 10 years is 7% every year. So by 2030, we've halved. That's just pure maths. So the urgency message can't be overstressed enough. And hopefully this blueprint gives corporates a roadmap to achieve this. So matching ambition and action. So just to finish off, I'd like to thank really, firstly, all the speakers for their time today, but actually it's many weeks of work before this, but also all the contributors, of which we've had very many inside WWF and BCG. And again, I'd like to extend my thanks to BCG, because without their support, and it's been a strong collaborative effort, I don't think we would have got to doing this as quickly as we have. So thank you again to our partners. And then finally to the participants today. Again, I know it's close to Christmas time or maybe a holiday time. So thanks for making the time today. You can get all of this material online. You can see the links in the messages below. You can also write to us at Corporate Climate Blueprint at wwfint.org. And we will do our best also to get back to those who have had questions unanswered today. So with that, thanks, and let's look forward to a decade of action. Have a good evening, day, morning. Bye-bye.